Just want to welcome you to tonight's Chat and Chowder. We're delighted that you're joining us, whether you're in the room or on the Zoom. My name is Mary Eintema. I'm the president of World Boston. I'm not going to do much of an introduction tonight because we have such a rich program. But first, a few reminders. As you may know, we hope you know, or that you're in the process of knowing, the mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. So thank you for being part of this mission. Thanks also to our hosts at Foley and Lardner for their kind hospitality. James DeVellis, who's the chair of the World Boston Board, is here. He's a partner at Foley. And I want to also, of course, thank out Natalie Mace, our Director of Operations and Global Engagement Programs, who is doing everything to make this event happen, along with other great World Boston colleagues. So if you're a World Boston staff or board member, please raise your hand. And everyone else, please go talk to them later. And last, but certainly not least, we want to thank the Lowell Institute, which very generously supports Chat and Chowder and the Great Decision Series, as well as our annual State of the State Department program. With their help, Chat and Chowder is now free of charge, which is really an incredible advance to our mission. So we would not be able to do this without their support, nor without yours. So we are making a bet that the community will just choose voluntarily to donate. So I invite you all from time to time. No, unfortunately, it's not a joke. It may be free of charge, but it's not free of cost. So we really invite the community to think about, what would I pay for a ticket? And just from time to time, get online and donate, or send us a check, or wait till the end of the year. And please donate what you can, particularly so that more and more people can take advantage of our programming who otherwise wouldn't be able to. All right, enough of that. I also want to mention, I'm not sure if she's here yet, but we're joined this evening by Ifeosa Nkem Onyepe, who is reporting on tonight's event for our blog. She's currently a fifth-year PhD candidate in history at Harvard, researching rural economic development. You can read her recap of tonight's event on our website, and you can volunteer to do the same thing for another event. So keep that in mind. Upcoming events. Next, we have a lot going on, so mark your calendars. November 2nd, we're hosting a very special reception at Ginkgo Bioworks, which is one of the coolest companies celebrating women in STEM. So this is a program is a unique opportunity to interface with our citizen diplomacy work. This is a program that connects us with women leaders in STEM from 24 different countries. So several of the delegates will offer remarks, and there'll be refreshments and networking and a tour of their lab space, which is wicked cool, as we say around here. Space is quite limited on that, so if you want to join in, do so. Then November 8th, we'll be back here for Chat and Chowder with Dr. Sung Yoon Lee to discuss this fascinating new book, The Sister, The Extraordinary Story of Kim Yo-jung, the most powerful woman in North Korea. You can learn more and register for both of these programs and donate through our website or using the QR codes. Finally, housekeeping. When we turn, sorry, that's live. When we turn to audience Q&A, please raise your hand. And when I call on you, a colleague will bring the microphone to you. We will try to take some questions from Zoom, which you can put into the Zoom Q&A. By the way, I apologize ahead of time for I'm probably going to be using my phone, which is how I'll stay in touch with Natalie and what's happening on Zoom. So at long last, tonight's program, we are so thrilled to be joined by Emmanuel Akyeampong, working on pronunciation, to discuss his new book, Independent Africa, and to have as a special guest moderator our friend Scott Taylor. In the interest of time, I'm going to introduce them briefly, but I encourage you to look at their impressive biographies online. So Emmanuel is Ellen Gurney Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard, and was previously the Oppenheimer Faculty Director of the Harvard University Center for African Studies. He's also a faculty associate at the Weatherhead Center and a member of the executive committee of the Hutchins Center. A former chair of the Committee on African Studies, he was instrumental in creating the department at Harvard of African and African American Studies. I am just going to blast forward because he has received so many awards and fellowships. I'm not going to do them justice. He received his PhD in African history from the University of Virginia. In 1993, he received his master's degree at Wake Forest University, North Carolina, where he concentrated on English labor history. Interesting combo. And his bachelor's in history and religions from the University of Ghana in 1984. So Scott Taylor, as I said, our friend who is Dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies at another fine institution on the river, BU, Professor of International Relations. There, his research and teaching interests are African politics and political economy, with a particular emphasis on business-state relations, private sector development, governance, and political and economic reform. He's a relatively new Bostonian, member of our community, previously taught at Smith College and most recently at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, where he was also vice dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion. He's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a member of the International Advisory Board for the Southern African Institute for Policy and Research, and a member of the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy. So I'm particularly thrilled that Dean Taylor is with us because he is moderating tonight's discussion. No, seriously, it's wonderful to have two excellent scholars and friends of the organization with us. So with that, I will leave it to both of you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you to World Boston for having us here tonight. And thank you all for being here. I'm thrilled to be with my friend and colleague, Emmanuel Akyeampong, to talk about his book and the implications of it. And it's a recent book, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to get a copy. I was able to read it recently, and our conversation will jump off from talking about the book. But let me just say that it is a real tour d'horizon of of African late colonial, post-colonial history, and looking at particularly at four of the most impactful and influential leaders of that time, and leaders who inspired their populations, who led their countries to independence. But I'm a political scientist by training, and the book is it starts in history, and it starts in this era of independence and its era of excitement around economic reform, around geostrategic relations, and so on. But it really weaves a very wonderful path all the way to the present, and it's some of those issues will preoccupy us, I think, tonight, about talking about the implications of some of this founding. And so, and maybe I'd like to start there, and sort of thinking as you frame the book, the first question, it seems to me, is probably most of you folks haven't read it yet, but I hope you will soon, which gets to why these leaders, and why did you write this book? And I asked that to add a little bit more detail. This particular collection of leaders, Sekou Touré, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, they and who am I leaving out? Senghor. And so, of course, Leopold Senghor. Sorry to my Senegalese colleague here. Were giants of the African independence period. But and while they were immensely popular in their time, for a time, history has treated them differently, and they've been utilized and repurposed and brought back out at different times in history to symbolize different things. And I'm very curious about, one, again, why write a book like this focusing on these leaders as your anchor? And then what, if we think about the vacillation, the fluctuation, and how these particular leaders have been treated over time. What is the history of these four in particular? Why do they warrant re-examination today?
Thank you, Scott, and thank you all for coming. And Mary and Natalie and James, thank you for this opportunity. So I wrote this book for three reasons. I'm a Ghanaian born in Ghana. I've lived in the US longer than I've lived in Ghana. In 1960, 17 African countries became independent. They were preceded in 1957 by Ghana, the first Black African country south of the Sahara. So come 2010, there were a lot of 50th anniversaries of independence. And it generated a lot of debate and a lot of chatter. To take Ghana's in 2007, we couldn't even keep the lights on in Ghana at that time. So people wondered, is it worth celebrating 50 years of independence and spending $20–30 million, which can go towards infrastructure or energy to correct them? And it continued. Once we got to 2010, the very import or significance of independence had come into question. Was political independence meaningful? Did it create or open up any significant opportunities for Africa? And so I wrote for three reasons. And this is a book that I enjoyed writing because I think I wrote it for academics, but I also wrote it for ordinary people, Africans, and I wrote it to be accessible so that anyone with some education can pick it up and read it. So one reason for writing this is to argue that the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s were really important decades, in that African political independence was not irrelevant, it wasn't an insignificant term. Indeed, I've often been reminded that in 1957, both Ghana and Malaysia became independent in the same year. Their GDP were comparable. Today, and I'm like, yeah, I know. Today, they are very different states. In the early 1960s, development economists thought South Korea was a hopeless case compared to countries like Ghana and Zambia. In 2017, the value of South Korea's trade with the world was more than all of Africa combined. So that is point one. Two, I think that the 60s and the 70s, the effort, the imagination, the resources that leaders of the early nation state committed to nation building, to economic development, to international relations and world making, we seem to have forgotten that. I like the World Bank, I like the IMF, but it bothers me when I read works on political economy or by economists on Africa, and they assume that before structural adjustment, economic policy was poor in Africa. After structural adjustment, sound policy came in. And so I read African economists and political scientists write about Africa before 1980, and it's like a paragraph or two. And the reference is often the World Bank. And I worry that the World Bank has become a knowledge bearer, it's become a funder of projects, it's become a program manager, and it's become an assessor of Africa's development. So as a historian, I went back to the period, sat with the sources from the period to write what I hoped would be a rich history to bring people into this period where there were possibilities, where Nkrumah was seen as a world leader who could help resolve the conflict in Vietnam. Today, you think of it and it sounds like foolishness, or hubris. But in the mid-60s, his stature globally merited that. So, and then the third reason I sort of saw the urgency in this is this. My colleague, Danny Roderick, who is a professor of international political economy, argues or points out that post-COVID, the global economy will see three important trends. One would be a rebalancing of the relationship between states and markets, and that we will see more state control and regulation. That is one. Two, we've seen hyper-globalization. I think all states had the reality check when we couldn't even have PPEs and we had to go to China to get masks. And then all of a sudden you say to yourself, we've outsourced too much. We need to bring some of these back. The importance of national sovereignty, of autonomy. So we are going to see a more move in that direction in consideration of both economic and social domestic concerns. And then third, he points out that there will be more modest economic growth. And so the world, in terms of governments and publics, must moderate their expectations of what they expect of their country. If this is the situation, at present, all of Africa's economic models are externally derived. So is the World Bank and the IMF going to tell us what should be our expectations and agenda for the future? So I wanted to provide a book that gives us meat, that situates us in a time period that even excites us about what could have been possible. Yes, we blew it, yes, but what was possible? And where did we miss the mark? Looking at both national, regional, continental, and at the international levels. So this is why I wrote the book. Why the four individuals? I wanted to choose four individuals. This was a generation that treated themselves as a cohort. And as I read the sources, they would overlap in so many ways that a comparative approach made sense. But I also wanted to choose different trajectories to show the different roads traveled. They all converge in that all the countries become bankrupt by the 1980s. They will go to the World Bank and IMF for structural adjustment, but they got there through different paths. So Ghana was the model economy, became independent in 1957. Compared to other tropical African countries, it had a very educated population. It had a very good civil service. It had a foreign reserve of 200 million pounds sterling, about $500 million then. At that time, when people bet on a country that was going to win the race, they would have bet on Ghana, and many did. It would also attempt to decolonize its economy, something that others did not attempt. And so I look at what motivated that experiment and how that experiment unraveled. So that is Ghana. By 1965, to cut to the chase, Ghana is bankrupt. Second is Guinea and Sekou Touré. In 1958, Charles de Gaulle will campaign across Africa about the new French community. And there was a referendum across Africa. And Francophone African countries could vote yes, they wanted to be part of the community, or they could vote no, and they could become independent immediately. Everybody seemed to have wised up and voted yes, but one country. And that one country was Guinea. How it made that decision, we can maybe talk about that later. And France decided that Guinea needed to be punished for its impudence. So everything left. Even the bank was emptied of whatever money was left. They took furniture, they took their records, and as they left, they even cut the telephone wires. For almost 2 decades, Guinea didn't even have the documents on which to base its planning in terms of national development. So that was Guinea. But Guinea became a hero. African Americans loved Guinea. It stood up to France and all of that. So I look at Guinea's trajectory, beginning with a rather heroic birth of the nation. By the time we get to the 70s, Sékou Touré had become a dictator. A considerable proportion of the population had emigrated. And by the time he died in 1984, I guess Guineans were just very happy to bury him. So that's Sékou Touré. Then I choose Senghor. And Senghor was an erudite, perhaps one of the smartest Africans who have ever lived, maybe more French than even the French. The first African actually to become a member of the French Academy. So really erudite. But he also believed in a close relationship with France. So as decolonization was unfolding, as far as Senghor is concerned, in the 50s, even Europe is moving towards an economic community, the ECC. They who have more money, much more the smaller, poorer African countries. So he figured that after 2 or 3 centuries of France exploiting Africa, this is the wrong time to let France go. And that we should forge a federation on independence so that France's deep pockets could fund the economic and the social development of Francophone Africa. It will become an empire of citizens. So whereas others wanted, Nkrumah is arguing about neocolonialism, we need to cut the umbilical cord to the colonial, former colonial government. Senghor is clinging to France, even wants a closer relationship. So that is a different party. And then last is Nyerere in Tanzania, because Nyerere and Tanganyika, then as it was called, was a UN-mandated territory. As a former German territory after World War I, when Germany lost in World War I, its colonies became either French or British trusteeships. Somehow one, Southwest Africa, which is today Namibia, for some reason was given to South Africa, but that is another conversation for another day. So their path to independence was different. It was through the United Nations, because the United Nations had supervision over mandated territories. So they will have a referendum, they will vote, and then they will become independent. So these were 4 very different paths, 4 very charismatic leaders. And I wanted to explore how they approach nation building, how they build their economy, and how they position their countries and themselves on the global and the international stage.
Yeah. Let me pose one more question and then we'll open it up for discussion, and I hope we get wide participation. Well, first of all, I feel like I have to defend political scientists. Not all of us start our analysis in 1980. 1979 was the first structural adjustment loan, the oil facility to Senegal, actually. But no, I think you indeed the importance of history and how it has to inform our contemporary analysis. So this is one. Maybe I'm heretical, but one political scientist who deeply believes that. The other thing is the comparison to East Asia, particularly Korea and Malaysia. That comparison, you know, I have worked far more in Zambia than in many of the countries that Emmanuel has worked in, which is always compared to South Korea. The Zambian economy and South Korean economy were the same size in 1960, I think it was. But again, and your book illustrates this, we need to consider that dichotomy will get us into trouble. We need to think about the nature of the post-colonial state in Asia versus Africa. We need to think about the establishment of bureaucracies. We need to think about quite a number of things. personally, I think culture is not one of the things we think about. But the other is geopolitics and the nature of post-war geopolitics and the relationship that Asia had with particularly the United States versus Africa's relationship with the United States. And it's to that I want to turn quickly before we open it up for questions. And thinking about, Professor Akyeampong talks in the book about this notion of I'm going to make sure I get it, positive neutralism, that leaders, especially Kwame Nkrumah, tried to pursue this positive neutralism. I think it's akin to what one of my colleagues, Jorge Heine at the Pardee School, and others have been talking about more recently as active non-alignment. We're seeing, sort of an attempt to not necessarily be east or west, but thread that line between and get investment from both and engagement with both. But what seemed to prove true in most African countries, especially in the 1960s and especially at the height of the Cold War, was that they had to, as vigorously as they tried to pursue positive neutralism, the U.S. in particular forced them into one camp or the other. And so, I wonder again, as we see today, in some might differ with my characterization, but the reemergence of a sort of a Cold War politics in Africa to some degree, with the heavy presence of China, which is generally more economic, but economic and political are linked, and the increasing presence of Russia again in many African countries. What does that say about the lessons of this, of the lessons, indeed the viability of actually being neutral? And what does that mean? Tell us a little bit.
So for the US, to begin with, Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, after whom we named an airport. You know the one, right?
Name begins with John Foster.
For the two of them, African non-alignment or positive neutralism was just a disguise for communism. So they didn't take that seriously. It took the ascendancy of John F. Kennedy for there to be a rethinking. So for Eisenhower, if you wanted advice on how to relate to Africa, you went to either the colonial powers or the former colonial powers. Africans were almost like minors. Kennedy, on coming into power, decided that actually, after studying several of the leaders, he didn't think they were communists. He believed they were nationalists. And there's an interesting and important connection between nationalism, the nation state, organization, and industrialization. It's almost like a package. And that if he sat down with the leaders from Africa, got to understand them, and maybe worked with USAID and other organizations to package modest aid programs for them, many of them would desert the Soviet Union. Sékou Touré, when the French took everything after Guinea voted no, the first person Sékou Touré wrote to for help was Eisenhower. Eisenhower didn't even reply. So Sékou Touré, the Soviets came in because Guinea didn't know how to operate its electrical power grid. It couldn't run the waterworks. It couldn't. So Soviet technicians came to make sure the lights would stay on. So he would explain to Atwood, who became America's ambassador, that the technicians are here by default because we need to keep the electricity on. We need to. It's not that I have an ideological preference. In the 3 years of Kennedy's reign, more African heads of state visited the White House than at any time in America's history to the present. And he forged what he called personal diplomacy. He brought them, he would learn about them and their countries, he would ask about their families, he would put together packages for them. he declared the 1960s the decade of development. And Africa was at the center of that vision. So that is when he was assassinated in 63, Sekou Touré would talk about losing his only friend in the outside world. And the drift to a more controlled economy in Guinea would be after the death of Kennedy. Russia also did not believe in positive neutralism. It just wouldn't say it like Eisenhower and Dulles, but it would do things that kind of sabotaged your efforts at neutralism. So, for example, in 1961, it would give Sekou Touré the Lenin Award, and you think it's a great thing and you accept it. But by accepting it, it also kind of implicated you. It made you almost like a communist. So things like that. It would invite in 61, it would invite Ghana, Mali, and Guinea to send representatives to the annual meeting of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. You think it's an honor, you go. But by association, then you... So both were not highly supportive of positive neutralism. The African countries knew that. So there's emerging work that shows that there was often a preference in dealing with the second world. So they would rather go to Poland, Bulgaria, and countries like that for financial exchanges and assistance and aid than go to Russia itself, because they did not come out of independence to come under the tutelage of either the United States or the Soviet Union. But they needed two things to develop. They needed aid or capital, they needed technology, and it was in both places. The Soviet Union had technology, but it didn't have money. So you could get them to help you build the factory, they can bring equipment, they can bring the technicians, but if you wanted cash, it was America that had cash. In the 60s, both did not know much about Africa, both were learning. There was one period, even the Soviet Union sent Guinea a gift of snow plows. It doesn't snow in Guinea. So each were trying to, they were each trying to figure out Africa in the 60s. And for me, that's the exciting part, that neither the Soviet Union nor the United States knew much about Africa in the 60s. By the time we get to the 80s, the World Bank and the IMF have this hegemonic presence and knowledge. And I remember a time when they knew nothing. So I want to take us back to that period for us to sit in that period. So positive neutralism ideally was good, but what it meant is that either side didn't embrace you fully. So maybe it would have made sense when Nkrumah was overthrown or when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. The CIA was in all of that. So perhaps it would have been better just to choose one side, ignore the other, and bite the bullet, and you may have gone further than trying to be neutral and playing both, and both were suspicious of you, and in some cases it ended in your overthrow.
Well, why don't we, sorry, I'm going to turn the mic over to Mary. So why don't we take some questions?
Anyway, thank you both very much. I have a feeling that we're going to have quite a lot of questions, and I encourage you to raise your hands. What I propose doing is, let's just get the questions. You don't have to direct them to a particular speaker, and then we'll leave the two of you to sort out who will address the question or whether both. So please, hands up. We've got 1, 2, let's go Henry, and then over here, a mic will come to you. And
thank you both very much for the interesting discussion. My name is Henry Breyer. I actually used to work at World Bank and in communications. And something that I remember very well is the Africa section was working on a particular public health issue, and that was river blindness. And there, in fact, is a statue at a tribute to the efforts to fight river blindness. So I'm wondering if you would, this was years ago, I haven't been in DC in many, many years, but I was wondering if you would give us the modern day update of what's happening with the fight against river blindness.
Hi, good evening. Thank you both gentlemen for the presentations. I read somewhere that boundaries in Africa are actually artificial. The colonial powers created artificial countries, in that warring tribes were created into states. And how true is that with respect to the four countries in your book? Ghana, Guinea, Senegal, and Tanzania.
So let me start with Henry. I like the World Bank. There were a couple of years in my life that I was a consultant for the World Bank. So if you put my name in Google, it was the World Bank sometimes that showed up and not Harvard, which was interesting.
Me too.
You see, that makes two of us. In terms of river blindness, one of the most fertile areas in terms of cultivation and agriculture are river basins. But river basins also tended to have from the black simulium fly, which causes river blindness, or onchocerciasis and other things. You have bilharzia and the rest. So the challenge in newly independent Africa is that some of the most fertile, potentially fertile lands were vacant lands because of the presence of onchocerciasis or river blindness. And then there would be the World Bank, but another important institution was the Carter Center. And Jimmy Carter will play an important role. And it appeared that a pharmaceutical company called Merck years back had developed a veterinary drug called ivermectin.
People will know it.
Okay.
It's the COVID drug.
Okay. Well, it seems to have had several lives. And they would discover that ivermectin was actually effective against river blindness or onchocerciasis. So Carter and Merck had a conversation, and Merck decided that they would provide ivermectin for Africa indefinitely, so long as it was needed. And so they did for years. So there is an onchocerciasis control program, or OCP. It started in the Volta River Basin, so Burkina Faso and Ghana, and then it expanded across West Africa. It still is there. There are a couple of challenges. One, a drug, however effective, eventually people develop resistance. Merck committed to supplying ivermectin indefinitely, but not necessarily to going into research and development to replace it when ivermectin loses. So the future of onchocerciasis has question marks based on whether pharmaceutical companies consider this worthwhile invest in R&D, especially to bring second-generation drugs after ivermectin.
Well, yeah, interestingly enough, when Merck made that donation, I bought Merck stock. So that's a company. That's a company. No, because it was a company that I wanted to support for that reason, just because it donated the ivermectin. So on the colonial borders, I'll just say, yeah, and I'll turn it back to you for the comment on the particular countries. But I mean, that's a problem throughout Africa, right? That the borders were imposed by the European powers in the Conference of Berlin in 1885-86. And by and large, the borders were solidified by the early 20th century, and for the most of Africa, those borders have been sacrosanct for 100 years, which is phenomenal when you think about it, since they're completely artificial. They often make no account of geographic boundaries or human communities, and so you have people split on all sides of borders, and almost no country has a single identity. They're multi-ethnic. And think about the challenges that imposes for governance, for nation building, which Emmanuel has looked at very carefully in the book. But to me, as a political scientist, and you know, others have argued about the stateness of the African state. If you can't project sovereignty because the state is just a border on a map, but the state as a set of institutions doesn't have the power to extend its authority in a way to express sovereignty, arguably one of the preconditions for statehood. But the fact that these borders have been so durable, I think is I don't know. I'm not sure whether it's necessarily good, but it is fascinating that these borders have been preserved. Part of that is the establishment of the African Union in the 1960s, and the reification of borders. But what's interesting is that there have been very few interstate conflicts, and there have been very few irredentist movements to try to combine different ethnicities across borders in Africa over time. And there have been very few shifts. South Sudan recently, Eritrea in 1993, some other modest movements, but there hasn't been a wholesale shift. And it is a fascinating outcome that Africans have, in many cases, tried to build states within these completely artificial constructs. Unlike this, for those of you who are familiar with state formation in Europe, which is sort of becomes the kind of, at least in my literature, the sort of model for state building.
I'm restraining myself because I want to ask questions as well. So let's go to Val and then Amadou.
Thank you. Val Boradam, Northeastern University. I really enjoyed this presentation and discussion. I'm really curious about both the Soviet technical and material assistance and the assistance of the socialist countries in those African countries at the time, compared with the indebtedness that these countries then experienced, but not to the socialist countries elsewhere. And I wonder if you could also compare that kind of technical and material assistance of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc countries at the time with China today, because African countries are now indebted to China in a way that they were not to the Soviet Union and the communist bloc at the time, or to the Western powers and to the IMF and World Bank. No, I don't like the IMF or the World Bank. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to learn from you and recount all these important landmarks and moments of African history. My name is Amadou Seck. I'm the honorary consul for Senegal in Massachusetts, but I'm in academia. I'm a teacher. But the profile that I would probably talk about most for me is that I think myself to be a Pan-African Federalist, not a Pan-Africanist, a Pan-African Federalist, because there's an organization out there called the Pan-African Federalist Movement, supported by Nyerere, Emma Nyerere, who is a descendant of Nyerere in East Africa, and other personalities. But my question for the historian and the political scientist is what would be the way today that can fruitfully result in African unity? Given that in history, we've had so many initiatives and failures since 1900 with the Pan-African conferences. And even until recently, last year in Togo, the 9th Pan-African Congress was held. So there are still initiatives trying to work into creating the momentum for African unity. And Nkrumah also, unfortunately, did not have what he wanted. Instead of a federal United African States, he got the Organization of African Unity. And now the African Union is looking at the horizon 2063 for the political unification of Africa. Can we wait that long? Thank you.
Okay. I think it is fair that I answered the first one and you answer the second one. Okay, so Soviet technical and material assistance in the Eastern countries, that it did not result in indebtedness. And to compare that with China today. And I think that as I pointed out, the Soviet Union, the Eastern countries, they could come with the technical assistance. The Soviet Union had become an industrial power through a process that Samir Amin described as delinking. So it had developed, but it didn't have deep pockets in terms of cash. It had some rubles, yes. We can talk about that. Okay. So they could assist with building a factory. So when Nkrumah's industrialization plan had two parts. From the West, primarily US, World Bank, USAID, etc., he will build the Akosombo Dam. He will have power for industrialization. From the East, he had a whole line of factories that he wanted to build. And they would help build, they would provide the machinery, the technical support, and the electricity from the West would power the Soviet factories. It didn't happen. The month after the dam was inaugurated, he was overthrown. So this idea that you could eat from both sides, it didn't happen. Today, I guess the one who holds most of US debts is China. And that's the difference, in that China has deep pockets, even in terms of US dollars and US bonds and things like that. But China is doing something not too dissimilar from what the Soviets did, you see. The Soviets, they were kind of doing barter trade. China calls it resource-backed loans. So the Soviet Union will come, they will build you a railway and this and that, and you could pay in primary commodities and minerals and things like that. Indeed, when Nkrumah was overthrown, the US made sure to impress on the government that came in that they cannot do barter with the Soviet Union. China is doing the same thing today. Ghana, they built us the Bui hydroelectric dam. We paid with cocoa and with some gold. And they're doing that across the continent. But China also has deep pockets. So it's giving developmental loans and other things. So not only are we doing barter trade, we are also borrowing money. And it's a wider range of financial facilities. And I think one of the challenges for African countries, they remember China from the 50s and the 60s. When China was our buddy, we did Bandung together. They brought those barefoot doctors. They did the Tanzania-Zambia railway. China today is a very different power. And I don't think many African countries have invested enough effort to study China and where China is today, and to craft the requisite policy agendas in how they interact with China.
Can I ask you a real quick follow-up question? What would that policy agenda look like?
think around 2016, I wrote an article looking at China, Africa. I have been a China watcher since about the early 2000s. I probably organized the first panel on China, Africa at Harvard around 2007, before it became very popular. For me, when we talk about China and Africa, I think it reflects an interesting understanding that we are comparing a country with a continent. When Togo negotiates with China, it is like a mouse and an elephant going toe to toe or whatever you would. So one of the things I liked was the possibility of regional development, infrastructure, manufacturing, technology, but through partnerships with China, in which richer African countries could pay more, because once the infrastructure is there, they would also be major beneficiaries. This idea that countries relate to China individually. Even South Africa's trade with China is mostly primary commodities and minerals going. So we need to come up with an approach that centers regions, centers infrastructure, and centers technology transfer. So in the mid-60s, I saw in China the possibility of our equivalent of the Marshall Fund, if we could manage it well.
Yeah. On China, I mean, it's a vexing issue, right? And the debt is incredibly worrisome, as was the debt to the multilateral development banks, as was the debt to the bilateral donors, and the debt itself is crippling. I'm slightly more agnostic about China and the infrastructure development. I mean, for those of you who travel on the continent, the infrastructure development is real, right? I mean, sometimes it was paid for, it was way too expensive. Sometimes there were backhanders that got, contracts. Sometimes the labor was not sufficiently African and mostly Chinese. And so who benefits from that? But the infrastructure, as you said, stays. How do you utilize it? How do you, mobilize the economy around new railways, new roads? And as somebody who's worked on the continent myself for over 30 years, the infrastructure transformation is, well, in a word, transformational, and largely built by the Chinese. So we need to that's why I asked you about policies, because I love the idea of a more regional approach to make it at least a semblance of equal partners. As for, I'm not a specialist on African integration, so but if I may, since Emmanuel gave me the harder question, the route to African unity. I don't know if you look at past examples or even current examples, the Senegambia, right? The Senegambia Federation, the Central African Federation, the old East African community. These things broke up. Why did they break up? Well, for different reasons, but underlying all of it was what I said before, was that this sovereignty, this sort of the notion of state identity, however artificial, actually meant something, that these states became rivals and self-interested actors, right? And so that they see their interests as states in the international system, and even in competitive space against in some cases, against their fellow African states. Now we have the African Union. One route to sort of African unity and integration is not to have China build the headquarters and pay for the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa, right? It has to be an African project, and to me, that's the worst signal of all, is that you had to borrow money and build this and have the Chinese build your headquarters. Not off to a good start. But I think that it goes back to the question of sovereignty. I'm not very bullish on I like what you said about Pan-African federalism as opposed to sort of African integration of the kind that I think that the AU aspires to. I mean, if we look at Europe and Brexit and everything else in Europe, integration is hard, and it's hard to sustain because of the self-interested polities. The fact that African economies are often producing the same products means that economic integration is very, very difficult until you have meaningful industrialization across the continent where value addition can be done in different countries, and they are adding to each other's economies rather than competing with one another. It becomes a very difficult premise, it seems to me. So if again, another try at a kind of a more federal or confederal type model might have more. I might be more bullish about that. That being said, I'm actually very, very optimistic about the continent over the long term. But the Du Boisian Pan-Africanist project, we'll see. 2063, I won't be here, so we'll see that.
All right. Wow. A lot of topics suitable for an entire continent. Please join me in thanking two world-class thinkers on these topics that we just got to have a conversation with. Thank you, Emmanuel Akyeampong and Scott Taylor. So the book, we hope you'll read it, right? Well, we hope you'll buy it over in the corner. We're going to walk over there and you can buy it and get it signed if the author is willing. And the flyers on your tables are for you because we want to see you again soon. For example, next week, November 2nd. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, World Boss. What a great group. And we're here till 7:30.